Hey everyone, welcome to the program, WRSA Radio. I am your host, Grenadier One. As always, I hope you are having a good week, the last week of 2021 as we shuffle off into 2022 and look forward to, I don't know what god-awful hell we're going to face, but we'll face it together, and I have no doubt that we will prevail. So keep your spirits up, keep your powder dry, and have a good New Year. Now let's get into the show this week. So last week and really in some weeks prior to that, there've been a lot of conversations on Gab and other places, other sites about the tensions between NATO, the U.S. really, and the Russians. And I want to talk about that because I got involved in some of that last week with a couple of people on Gab. And they took me to task saying I was stupid and wrong and I was out of my league and, on my position, what I think about some of this stuff. So what was my position? Well, I'll get into that. But first off, let's set the stage of the conversation so you guys understand what this is all about. Much has been made in the mainstream media about the diplomatic conflict that is currently raging between NATO and Russia. And this is a high-level dispute, and while you may be just seeing the focus on Ukraine, understand it's far more than just Ukraine. Ukraine, while it's not really just a pawn, because I think it's a little insulting to call them just a pawn, they're not the queen either, okay? They're maybe more like a rook on the chessboard. Russia is threatening to invade Ukraine, but that's not a foregone conclusion. I don't, necessarily think it's going to happen, or it's destined to happen. It's a consequence on the table for Putin to implement if diplomatic negotiations fail to produce the outcome that he's wanting. So what does he want? Well, Russia's asked for a complete withdrawal of NATO from Eastern Europe and specific promises that no further attempts to expand NATO eastward will happen. Now, I don't see that happening, and I doubt that Putin believes it will happen either, at least in totality, which tells us that he's probably willing to accept something far shorter than that. Some concessions, some middle ground that they can come to. And NATO's response so far is honestly murky. As it looks like they've, given some signals that they're willing to assist the Ukraine in their defense, but it does not look like they are willing to commit a lot of ground forces to that support. I think advisors and some forces on the table, but I don't think anybody is talking about rolling armored brigades into Ukraine. In the past, I would have had no doubt that an agreement would be reached at the diplomatic table because there were still some adults in the room for NATO, which we all know is really basically the U.S. With this administration, however, that goes flying out the window. In fact, I believe that all of this is coming to a head simply because Putin wants to test this administration. If he gets, idle brain Sleepy Joe in there, then it would not shock me to see a limited invasion of the Ukraine. I have spoken about that before, and I think Russia will probably take a portion of that country to really facilitate better control over the Black Sea ports and the Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine. I think this is all the precursor to that, and it's just a test to see how far the resolve of NATO, and more specifically Biden, can be pushed. Which is why I said, Ukraine is not central to the whole thing. It's just a tool in the process. I don't think that Putin is willing to risk nuclear conflict over Ukraine, which brings us to my position with regard to specific weapons the Russians and the Chinese have, more specifically hypersonic missiles. For those who are not aware, hypersonic missiles are, the so-called game changer on the block that have suddenly made everyone quake in their boots, and, the faction that likes to heap scorn on the U.S. military and, get their knickers all moist I don't fall into either of those camps. Gab has its cliques of guys who just love to see the Russians and the Chinese flex military capability because they believe it signals, an end to U.S. dominion or globo homo, whatever you want to call it. I don't disagree with them on that. We need to see some of that. We certainly need to see an end to that flexing, but I would prefer that we do not see that happen concurrent with a collapse of, in international power of the U.S. What needs to happen is something akin to the collapse of the Soviet Union. They maintained international power due to serious and disciplined control of their nuclear arsenal and managing to avoid an open civil war inside of their country. And my preference would be that we, collapse that globalist reach and foster a better, more open relationship with Russia and do whatever we can to contain the Chinese. And I think the world is far better off with that outcome. That's kind of I digress a bit there. So let me get back to the overall point. So this clique of people, they love to pile on the U.S. military and basically label it as a paper tiger and, highlight every failure and every weakness. And the failure in Afghanistan being the most recent, just dogpile as an example. It's important, I think, to be able to recognize where you have weaknesses and where mistakes are made. And the U.S. military is no different from anyone else here. And I mean, we could speak for literally days on how dysfunctional the Pentagon is and how it's filled with corruption and on and on and on. Like I said, globo homo. I get that. Serious people, serious observers of these things, however, recognize also that even a dysfunctional force is still capable of being capable. Okay? It's still very dangerous, very, very dangerous. No one seriously thought that when the Soviets collapsed and, their submarine fleet was sitting at the docks on their best day or washed up on shore in some cases, that it was, a great time to attack them with conventional weapons to try and finish them off. No one seriously thought that was a good idea because those aforementioned nuclear weapons. Hypersonic missiles are the latest in a long string of conventional weapon advances that shift the balance on the conventional side but do nothing to alter that nuclear détente. Only anti-ballistic missile systems really kind of shift that balance. And even then, I think we're so far removed from the Cold War that only the smallest number of advisors or thinkers would be willing to risk millions of lives and mass nuclear contamination on how effective those systems really are. No man-made system is perfect and works every time. And with nukes, even just a 1% failure rate of any defense system would result in dozens of warheads hitting their targets. That's unacceptable. At any rate, putting a new, really fast missile into deployment may take some options off the table for the other side, but it does not take all of them off the table. In fact, my thoughts are that in high-level situations, it makes things more dangerous. It ramps up the tension and pushes the conflict closer to an accident, an accidental outbreak. In fact, a very good book was written about that very situation. They made a very good movie about it and back in the 90s. It's called The Hunt for Red October. Maybe you've seen it. In the conversations on Gab, the focus was on the technical aspects of hypersonic missiles and how their speed made U.S. naval forces, almost completely incapable of defending them. If they were in range of the missiles. The proponents were going to this classic example of a U.S. carrier battle group out at sea, and they presented multiple examples of how China or Russia could launch a sneak attack on the carrier and her escorts and sink them or most of them. And I'm not arguing that point at all. I'm not disagreeing with them here. Any of those scenarios could occur. We could really get down into the weeds about that and talk about how the U.S. is lagging behind and not only fielding those types of weapons, but also fielding a good defense against them. And I don't dispute that mostly, which I'll get into later, my position was and is, once that happens, once you launch that attack, now what? What happens afterwards? What's the follow-up? What's the next move? What happens after the sneak attack occurs? What does the other side gain that they're willing to openly declare war on the U.S. and receive a nuclear retaliation over? Because that's exactly what will happen if Russia or China attacks and sinks a U.S. carrier. Let me be more detailed here. For nuclear powers, there's an understanding that is in place, a list of things or a group of things that are considered acts of war. And that list is far short of, attacking and sinking warships, even one warship, okay, much less a whole group of them. For example, jamming communications of military units is considered an act of war. For nuclear powers, if you violate these standing considerations, you're risking conflict that will escalate to a nuclear exchange. It's not really an if, it's a will. One side or the other will not allow conventional weapon imbalance to lead to their defeat, and they will escalate to the use of even their smallest nuclear weapons to try to bring that balance back into place, and then it just spirals out of control from there. Of course, it's entirely possible, and honestly, I pray to God more likely that somewhere along the way that someone would step in and get cooler heads into play and de-escalate the situation. But that's not going to happen until both sides have drawn a lot of blood. The risk that events spiral out of control so fast that it can't be called back is still really, really high. And this is why I say that having a conventional weapon imbalance is far more dangerous than people consider. It may lead some, one side's midwits to think that the advantage is enough to allow them to conduct a limited strike and then dial it back before it gets out of hand. But the other side will be in a position that they can't allow that. They can't allow that to happen. And since they have no conventional response that's equivalent, they'll escalate to those nukes faster. They may even if they have a range of responses if they had a range of responses, they wouldn't go to that nuclear option as quickly, right? For stating that position, I was called stupid by some people on Gab, which, whatever. That doesn't bother me, but I thought it made a good topic for a show today. And while I might agree that mutual assured destruction is stupid, it's not my idea, and it's kept the peace for 70 years. And I don't see hypersonic missiles from doing anything to change that, at least where the U.S., Russia, and China are concerned. Where they can change things, however, and where more advanced weapon systems do in fact pose a significant risk is with non-nuclear powers. That's because those same rules do not apply to non-nuclear nations. It's seen as a serious problem on the international stage for a nuclear power to threaten a non-nuclear power with nuclear weapons. That does project weakness and causes all kinds of downstream effects. It's not protocol. It's not something that countries do. You're supposed to be the adult. If you've got the nukes, you're supposed to be seen as the more sophisticated, the more capable nation, and you're supposed to just say, "Hey, I'll deal with you with more conventional means." That's the real danger to the U.S. and Western militaries from these weapons. If China or Russia sells them into the hands of another country like Iran or even a country like Venezuela, they could pose a significant risk to U.S. naval forces in particular. So yes, they are a problem that the U.S. needs a solution for, but they're not going to allow the Chinese and the Russians to just do whatever they want and dare the U.S. to respond. I just don't see that happening. Maybe I'm wrong there. Maybe you guys can give me some insight that I don't see there. Something to consider, however, is that they could be used as an excuse by the current weak and feeble-brained administration to justify inaction. I see this being more of a problem with China than with Russia. We suspect that Sleepy Joe is on the take with the Chinese, so he could very well stand off and refuse to assist Taiwan and state that he's doing so because of the super go fast missiles. There are a couple of other things to consider here. We're seeing a lot of press on these weapons and a lot of talking heads bantering about how dangerous they are, and we have to consider that this is complete overhype and that these weapons on paper are scary, but as they're currently deployed fall far short of that on paper capacity. The hype we're seeing could be largely driven by the military-industrial complex as a means of grifting more and taking more tax dollars into bloated programs to close the hypersonic missile gap. We don't really know. We don't really see information more than what people want us to see. We don't know what these weapons are really capable of because we have only seen what the Russians and the Chinese want us to see, and what our own military and defense contractors, who have seen more data than us, what they want us to see. Which brings me to the last possible consideration. All of this hype on our side may be a way for the secret deep state to more publicly announce capabilities that they've had for decades. Consider this. So the U.S. developed a hypersonic plane, a manned plane, not a missile, a manned plane, back in the 1960s. It was called Dinosaur, and had it went into production, it would have allowed very long range and very high speed bombing capability. Its development was shelved, and other projects like the X-15, X-23, there's several other X-planes that came out of that whole series of work. Those went even faster and even higher and went on to make history, setting all kinds of records. So this is not an area that the U.S. has no experience in or exposure to. We have a long, very long history of very secret projects that far exceed what our public capabilities are. So with that in mind, I want you to think about some of the UFO stories that we keep seeing in the mainstream media. One possible explanation for those, and something that foreign militaries no doubt consider, is that when we see the U.S. Navy talking about swarms of unidentified drones like aircrafts, around our ships, and they're tracking these unidentified high-speed and highly maneuverable vehicles, aircraft, we're not seeing ETs or even foreign military capabilities. What we may be seeing is our own secret weapons that are being tested, that the U.S. wants to show to the other guys, but also maintain a high degree of secrecy about the platforms. The U.S. personnel don't even have to be in on the test. For all that they know, it is a complete unknown. And that adds to the mystery. And every time you see one of these stories come up and you see video being released and acknowledged by the U.S. and talked about by official sources, you ask yourself what the think tanks and the military planners in China and Russia are thinking about. They have to be asking themselves, well, shit, is this something the U.S. has control over? And they know we have nothing that can touch it, but they can deny it exists. Nuclear weapons don't end conflict between these powers. They just make it take different forms. You have to do things through proxies, or you have to have really good plausible deniability. Secret aircraft that can do things that other countries aren't capable of give you plausible deniability. And perhaps things like ships catching on fire in port really are not accidents. Maybe they're the results of shots fired with weapons that the vast majority of the world doesn't even know exist. Now, that's all I got time for today, folks. Like and subscribe. Come see us over on Gab and the Mothership. Next week, I hope to have an interview for the show. Concerned American and I are planning on doing a year-end review, which I think is going to be a great show, but I will not be able to get it put out until probably next Sunday, so it will be delayed from the normal Friday posting that I do. But I think it's going to be worth it. I think you'll enjoy it. I know if you get a chance, go listen to the interview with Concerned American over on T.L. Davis's new podcast. But and come listen to next week's episodes to see what CA and I can put together. So anyway, I will see you on that episode.